Yeah, right. I'm a techno peasant, so I'll probably screw up. So I want to thank all of you for coming today. You're very fortunate to have so many outstanding Africanists in your community. I want to particularly acknowledge Jim Sweet, Neil Kodish, Luis Madureira, my colleague Ali Tripp, who was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a very wonderful scholar. And also my dear colleague, former colleague and friend, Fran Vuvers, who was such a central person in international studies at the University of Minnesota. Our loss is your gain. Once again, the Badgers screwed the Gophers. So those are football metaphors and stuff if you don't realize that. And there's so many other people like Luis Medrere who I want to thank my dear friend, former student, Marissa Moorman, who I'm sure most of you recognize is one of the leading scholars in popular culture, in history in the Portuguese-speaking world. So thank you, Marissa. The university is so fortunate to have you here. Again, Indiana's loss are the Badgers' gains. So given the violence and corruption and despair throughout Southern Africa that we're experiencing now, it may be difficult for you to imagine, to consider the possibility that 50 years ago, there was a sense of optimism and hope when I was a student here, that the liberation movements would persevere and that they would create new and socially just societies. And this was the case in the first instance. But they also achieved this goal of liberation by working collectively in one of the earliest and most concrete manifestations of a type of Pan-Africanism. The MPLA worked fiercely to support SWAPO in its struggle for the liberation of Namibia, and Frelimo in Mozambique suffered heavily to help the Zimbabwe liberation movement and also the ANC. These are distinct but very distant memories. Before I start my talk, I would like to talk for a second, not about myself so much as my positionality, because I am and I'm very happy to be both an academic and an activist. And I had a very close relationship with Michel, a man who I admired much. So when I was a graduate student here, I was working on my dissertation with Jan Vencina, and I went to Mozambique, and I saw the horrors of forced labor and racism and cultural arrogance. And when I came back in 1970, I started to work with the Mozambican Liberation Movement and the Committee for a Free Mozambique. And I saw that as part of my role, both as an academic and as an activist. In 1975, Frelimo came to independence. The people of Mozambique were free, and President Michel invited myself and my wife, Bobby, to work in Mozambique. We were cooperants. There were about 12 of us. Bobby worked for the Mozambican Women's Movement and taught in the law school, and I was the first person ever to teach Mozambican history. So when I tell my students and talk to my students about what lived underdevelopment is, it's when a new independent country has to rely on a white guy from the Bronx to teach their history because the Portuguese had suppressed it. So Mozambicans were taught about Portuguese songs and geography and the great kings, but nothing about Mozambican history. During that period, right after independence, was a moment of great euphoria. And we participated in that, worked very, very hard for the Mozambican Revolution. And I worked closely in a number of ways with President Michel. I'll be happy to talk about that afterwards. So I come here as a partisan, as well as a historian, as a scholar. And I don't feel at all, and I never felt, that the two are in opposition. I think you become, in my opinion, a better scholar if you have a deep insight, commitment to the people that you're studying. So let me go forward now and talk about Samora Machel. There's a poem written by a young man in 1986, shortly after Samora's death, which celebrates his contribution to the struggles in Zimbabwe. Now, I'm just going to go through these pictures quickly so I don't have to be deflected. Notice here, this area here, there's a common border, and this is where Frelimo and the Zimbabwean liberation movements fought together. There is President Samora. This is Herbert G. Tepo, who was the head of ZANU and was assassinated in the late early 70s. And Robert Mugabe with Samora coming to Beira. And then it says, welcome, comrade, President Samora. This is a ZANU publication. So the only picture, I have one more thing, of Joshua Como. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to provide a picture of Josiah Tungogara, who was the most significant militant in Zimbabwe. But anyway, so let me start now. Samora Machel's commitment to the liberation of Southern Africa was one of the foundational political and ideological beliefs. It was both a moral and strategic imperative. On numerous occasions, he proclaimed publicly and always to me that Mozambique cannot be free until Zimbabwe is free and the apartheid regime is dismantled. Yet, his critical role in the armed struggle of Zimbabwe has been largely ignored or not received the attention it deserves. Consider the short shrift Samora receives in The History of Zimbabwe, written by Alois Malambo, or Becoming Zimbabwe, edited by Malambo and Brian Rastafopoulos. And even Terence Range's classic work on peasants and peasant struggle makes only one allusion to Samora. Now, how do we explain this? How do we explain this erasure of history? Well, there are several reasons for this. The first and most important is that the Patriotic Front, that was ZANU and ZAPU, and the ruling party, had to write their own script. So they wrote their own script in which they essentially wrote out anyone who is not Zimbabwean. And so what you have is a situation from when the armed struggle starts, when the armed struggle starts, that there's no space for anyone who's not Zimbabwean. And in fact, this has enormous political consequences to this state, because the Mugabe and then Magugwana and then Managua, and then the soldiers who fought in the army, they are the beneficiaries, the war veterans. They the ones who become privileged and become their own ruling class within Zimbabwe. So they have to justify everything. Till this day, this memory and this script defines who has land, who has power, who the enemies are, etc. So it's very important that Frelimo and Samora's contribution were minimized or entirely erased. So that's one critical factor. Moreover, when you look at the historical script, they do mention Mozambique and Samora, but in the period after Zimbabwe's independence, in which they claim, accurately so, that Zimbabwean troops fought in Mozambique against the South African terrorists Frelimo and the MNR. And in fact, one of the leading figures in the Zimbabwean liberation movement, a man named Murangai, he said, of course we fought. It was our common struggle and our blood that was spilled. It was logical that we rushed to aid Frelimo. So in this script, Frelimo is the recipient of Zimbabwean aid and the aid of the war veterans, and not a co-partner, and even more than a co-partner, in the struggle for Zimbabwean liberation. Yet, when I talk privately to some of the people who helped to write the script and who are the beneficiaries, they acknowledge in private that Samora and Frelimo played an absolutely critical role. Zengai Mutumbuka, one of the Zimbabwean leaders, said, in our most difficult moments, when we were despairing in the 70s, even before Mozambique became independent, Samora Machel was our guerrilla in the bush. His influence extended well into Zimbabwe, and he was the Che Guevara of Southern Africa. Chris Musambangwe remembered that Samora gave us a new consciousness, a new sense of hope. He showed us what we could do. And General Joseph Kumalo said that Samora taught us discipline and the will to win. So today, I want to talk about Samora Machel and Frelimo. I want to emphasize that the focus on Samora is not meant to trivialize and minimize the very important work of the Frelimo military in the armed struggle and of Mozambicans, other Mozambicans who played a critical role in the diplomatic arena. It's the constraints of time that require me to focus primarily on Samora. As I said, someone whom I admired dearly, who was he and the people who died in the plane crash were very, very close and special to us. But it was Samora, the leader, with a clear vision of what a liberated Southern Africa would be for the region and the continent. His sense of justice, his powerful eyes, his eyes are radiant, and his smile, infectious smile, that could win over skeptics and world leaders from Margaret Thatcher to Fidel Castro. Indeed, when Castro came to a public rally in Beira in the late 70s, after Samora led the rally by singing several songs and really mobilizing people, and he used performance in such a powerful way, Castro said, Samora Machel is the only world leader who could win a revolution by singing. And for a person who was so attentive to presentation, as was Fidel Castro, that's really significant. So my thesis, and what I'm going to argue, is that Samora played a critical role, not only, and Frelimo. So every time I mention Samora, I mean Frelimo and Samora, let me be very clear, played a critical role not only in the armed struggle, in the military side, and he was himself a military officer, but in the diplomatic side. He played an absolute critical role in intervening in Zimbabwean liberation politics. Indeed, some would criticize him for intervening too much, but he had a clear idea of how the revolution should be fought and who should be fighting it. And so it is ironic that in this history, the historical narrative of Zano, the official history taught in schools, Samora is almost completely erased. So I want to talk, I want to describe very briefly 5 interventions that he made, beginning the first one in the 1960s, late 60s and early 70s. Now you have to remember, can I walk away from this? Because I feel so constrained. You have to remember that in the 60s, the Zimbabwean liberation movement was badly divided. There were two competing forces, one ZANU and the other ZAPU. And what distinguished them was that ZANU was peasants-based and was very linked to China. And ZAPU was getting all its support from Russia. So the Sino-Soviet split was a very big divisive factor. And in fact, the Soviet Union pressured the OAU to only recognize ZAPU in Como in the 60s. And from the 1963, when Samora, Michel and the second group of Mozambicans went to do guerrilla training in Algeria. And here's the point I want to make that's critical, and the point that Marissa made earlier. This is a period when, even though the art struggle was located in Southern Africa, in which prominent African leaders from all over the continent played a big role. So it was Ben Bella and the FNLA who provided the first guerrilla training for Frelimo. It was Julius Nyerere who provided much of the insights and the diplomatic cover. And it was Obasanjo in Nigeria who at critical moments interceded. So in a sense, there was this moment in 1975 to 80 when everything seemed possible. But there were also very big roadblocks. The first one, as I said, is that the Zimbabwean liberation movements were divided, not only by ideology and the Cold War and international links, but also ZANU, to the extent that it had a strategy, it was going to be peasant-based, and ZAPU had a more traditional emphasis on warfare, on traditional warfare using tanks and stuff, etc. But in any case, in 1969, after Eduardo Milan was assassinated and Samora came to power, the first thing that he did was to try to get ZANU, let me see, can you go back to the map? Sorry. So to try to get ZANU to try to get the Zimbabwean Liberation Forces, to work together and to join with Frelimo over here to begin to attack Zimbabwe, Rhodesians, and the Rhodesians were attacking Mozambique. So, and he went to ZAPU because that was the OAU recognized liberation movement, and ZAPU in Como expressed no interest. And so Samora broke with his Soviet allies and began to work with ZANU. And between 1969 and 1972, they began to organize guerrillas here to cross into Zimbabwe and convert. And in response, the Portuguese, the Rhodesian government, and the South African government signed an agreement known as the Algor Agreement, ALVOR, in which they combined military forces to try to defeat not only the Zimbabweans, but Frelimo. And for South Africa, it was absolutely imperative that they fight the war on the Zambezi River and not on the Limpopo River adjacent on the border of South Africa. So for South Africa, this was the test of its survival. And so what we find happening in this period, it was Samora, with the help of Julius Nyerere, works very closely with ZANU and with Josiah Tongogara, who was the military leader, and Herbert Chikepo, who we saw before, who was the political leader, both of whom were in exile. In Como, rejected essentially advances from Frelimo, and this created a situation in which Samora Michel would never trust in Como again. And so we have a situation in which Samora Michel turns to Josiah Tungogara and Herbert G. Teppo, and they intensify the armed struggle in the period from 72 to 73. And this was very, very significant. And that is the first intervention. Samora makes a decision that we can work with ZANU and not in Como, and that we're going to help to define who the leadership is and what the struggle is about, because he recognized that if Zimbabwe is not free, Mozambique will never be free. So this was a national priority, but it was also in some ways a bit intrusive, although, again, as I said, ZANU and ZAPU at this point were dysfunctional and were not working together. And the second intervention he makes is in the period from 1975 to 1977. Now, 1975 is critical in two respects. Mozambique becomes independent, so it now controls the border and has the potential to expand support for the Zimbabwean liberation movements. The second thing that happened is that Herbert G. Teppo, who was the political leader of ZANU, was assassinated in Zambia. He was assassinated in Zambia. There are multiple theories about who assassinated him, whether it was internal rivals of the South African. But what was clear was that he provided the intellectual leadership. And then the Zambians, for a set of reasons which are still not clear today, accused Tungogara, the military chief of ZANU, that he killed Chief Teppo. So what you find happening in 1975, at the moment of independence, in which Frelimo is supporting ZANU primarily, ZANU is in absolute crisis. ZANU is in an absolute crisis. And yet, Michel, from the moment they took power in June 25th, said, we must continue the war. But he also realized and remembered what happened in Guinea-Bissau when Cabral was killed, and what happened in Congo when Lumumba was killed, and what happened in Mozambique when his predecessor was killed. When the leadership is decapitated, the movements tend to fragment. And so he decided that he would intervene from a position of power. Now, Samora is a man of enormous ego. He was a great, very thoughtful person. He also was a bit romantic, and he used to say to me, when we would talk to him about how are you going to take on the South Africans, because that was his next goal. He said, we began with 100 boys and girls and no weapons, and we defeated the Portuguese. We could take on anyone. Of course, he was rewriting his own history, right? It was a very romantic way, unfortunately. But anyway, so the challenge then for Samora was that how do you maintain ZANU without a leadership? And what he did from his position of power and strength, at the high point of his position of power and strength and international influence, was directly intervene in the liberation politics. He called together the leaders of ZAPU and ZANU. He brought them to the capital and sat them down and said to them, you have to unite. If you don't unite, if you don't create a front together, the patriotic front, we will not allow you to use Mozambique as a base for attacks. And without Mozambique, there was no way that the Zimbabwean liberation movements would make any advances, because Zambia was very hostile to any armed struggle. So he called them together and he sat them down. He sat down the leadership, and particularly Jason Moyle, who was of the Zapu people, one of the most militant. So he bypassed Nkomo, and he sat them down and said, you have 2 months to figure out how to create a unified organization. At the same time, Samora used his influence, which was very substantial. You have to remember, 1975 is the year of revolutionary change. And he's one of the great heroes of Africa. So he goes diplomatically to the OAU, and he goes to Ethiopia, and he's a big hero in Somalia. And he says, there's going to be one Zimbabwean liberation movement, the Patriotic Front, and I want you to recognize that. And that means those of you like in Ethiopia who are pro-Soviet, you have to forget your concerns about ZANU. It's not about the Sino-Soviet War, it's about the liberation of Southern Africa. And he goes to 8 or 9 different countries in this 2-month period, while at the same time, he's pressuring ZANU and ZAPU to become one, which they do, and they use a military base all along the corridor to begin to encroach into Zimbabwe, to Rhodesia, and to make important political advances. So that's the second intervention he makes, and that Frelimo makes. The third is that Mozambique, under Samora Machel, endorses and accepts and vigorously enforces the UN-sanctioned economic boycott of Rhodesia. Remember, in 1964, Rhodesia had become independent under UDI. It was considered to be an illegal regime, but it was also closely tied to Britain because of white kith and kin, and also the United States loved Rhodesia because it was militantly anti-communist. And for everyone, it was about the Cold War, it wasn't about liberation movements in Southern Africa. So Mozambique has a strategic role to play in terms of enforcing embargoes, because the vast majority of imports and exports from Rhodesia went through the Mozambican port of Beira. Some went through South Africa. So Mozambique closed the port, and as part of a process to try to strangle the Ian Smith regime in Rhodesia. It cost Mozambique in the first 2 years $600 million in lost revenue, transfers, port fees, etc. Now, to show you how consequential that was, Mozambique's total volume of exports was only $250 million. So this new country with some reserves uses all its reserves to essentially enforce the UN sanctions against Rhodesia, and it has substantial success. The Rhodesians have to try to export their agricultural goods to South Africa. It gets very cumbersome, it's very expensive. So that's the third intervention that Samora Machel makes at a great cost to his own country, at an enormous cost, because Mozambique was an underdeveloped and impoverished country of itself. But Samora insisted that we'll never be free. We'll never be able to have sustained economic development until we get rid of the Smith regime and also South Africa, the apartheid regime. The fourth intervention he made was beginning in 1975 and through 1979. In that period, Frelimo opened up its frontiers to the frontline nations. But here's the, these alliance of Patriotic Front, the Patriotic Front. And not only opened up all this border area, but also provided arms and training and facilitated the training of 10,000 Zimbabweans, so young boys and girls, who came out into Mozambique because they were drawn by the appeal of Samora Michel and the motto that if they could do it in Mozambique, which was far less developed, then we could certainly do it in our homeland. So Frelimo Mozambique became a symbol of what was possible. They crossed over, thousands and thousands of them, 10,000 of whom Samora arranged to send to Ethiopia for training, military training, despite the fact that the Soviet Union was pissed at that. But they did it anyway. And in the period from 1975 to 1979, Frelimo intervenes military in so many different ways. They started all these camps here for those people who were not sent to Ethiopia. They established 6 different military bases. They provided large amounts of arms, some from China. They convinced even the Soviet Union to give arms to the Patriotic Front. And the Patriotic Front began to expand into this area in the farmlands and stuff. It's only after Mozambique is independent. Military advances. And Frelimo also provided troops, even though it didn't do it publicly. But 700 elite troops who said guerrillas who had fought the armed struggles accompanied and worked with the Patriotic Front. And what you see beginning to happen is a dynamic frontier of the liberation forces moving forward. It came at an enormous cost to Frelimo because the Rhodesians, the South Africans, and the Portuguese, who were united in the Algarve Agreement, attacked Mozambique mercilessly, not only through the Rhodesian army, where in one case they killed about 4,000 younger people and refugees that had crossed the border at Yanzonia, and there were numerous attacks on civilians, including on communal villages and cooperatives, all in this area of Tet. But it was not only that. The South Africans realized the potential threat because the frontier, the armed struggle, the border was moving southwards. And so what the South Africans and the Rhodesians did was to create a Black terrorist organization known as the MNR, which later became Renamo. And they initiated a reign of terror throughout this war zone area on the borders to try to pressure Mozambique to stop its assistance. And when I say a reign of terror, that's exactly what it was. These soldiers, mercenaries, white mercenary officers, and Africans who had fought in the Portuguese colonial army and the South African Rhodesia colonial army would go into communities and not only burn and destroy everything, but make young kids cut their mother's breasts off, cut their mother's ears off. So the young kids became disconnected, had nowhere to go. And many of them therefore joined Renamo in this period. So the South Africans and the Rhodesians create a counter-terrorist force with the idea of trying to destabilize Mozambique because of the commitment to ZANU, the Patriotic Front, but also Mozambique's commitment to the ANC, which I'll talk about later. And so the fourth intervention then is the direct military intervention of Mozambique in the armed struggle of Zimbabwe, which has a lot of success. And in a critical battle in 1979, the Rhodesians tried to destroy the whole Zimbabwean leadership that was in exile in Mozambique in a series of military bases. And Frelimo provided Soviet missiles as well as very sophisticated anti-aircraft weaponry that essentially led to the destruction of 2/3 of the Rhodesian Air Force. This takes place at Mbunda in 1979. It's Frelimo using these weapons and having the skills, and the Rhodesians had no ideas that they had the equivalent of SAM-6 missiles, and they destroyed 2/3 of the Air Force. Peter Walsh, who was the head of the Rhodesian Army, then tells Ian Smith, we can't fight. We have to figure out a negotiated settlement. And at the same time that this is going on, this dynamic guerrilla frontier is increasing. And of course, there's enormous support in the rural areas for the Patriotic Front because it had been 60 years of colonialism. And the Patriotic Front had one powerful slogan, land for the people, because the settlers had taken all the best lands and they were reduced to living in the most marginal areas. So what you have in the period from 1975 to 1979 is Mozambique, Frelimo, and Samora's very intense involvement. And he would speak with the head of the Zimbabwe militant, Cahora, whom he had convinced the president of Zambia to free. They spoke on a regular basis, on almost a daily basis, about the strategy. The final intervention is at 1979 at Lancaster House. Lancaster House will mark the negotiations and ultimately the independence of Zimbabwe. But there were many, many hurdles. And it was, again, even though it's not acknowledged publicly, but in oral histories that I've collected, both on Zimbabwe and Mozambican part, there was Samora, Michel, and Cahora, who together orchestrated the negotiations. Now, there's two things to mention very quickly. I'll stop in about 3 minutes. First, Samora sent Fernando Juan, who was a very close friend of mine, to England and convinced the Queen of England that England should recolonize Rhodesia because in UDI it had illegally, the white government had illegally declared independence. The Queen thought it was a great idea. Samora then went to Margaret Thatcher, who was a very conservative man, and used all his charm and his smiles and his humor and said, to convince Margaret Thatcher that once that happens, she should send the governor back to Rhodesia, and that would then Britain would be able to participate in the negotiations which would be held in Great Britain, which would lead to the independence. But there were two other issues that came up. One of which, Samora not only distrusted Mugabe, distrusted Nkomo, but the fight between Nkomo and Mugabe over who was going to be the leader intensified. And ultimately, the Mozambicans convinced Nkomo, who was the elder, but who never had any military training, that he could be the public spokesman. It would be a joint leadership. So that took care of one issue. The other issue was very critical, was the land question. And here, Mugabe insisted that there would be no good negotiations unless there was a land agreement first. But who was to pay? Britain said it couldn't pay for land that the whites would have to give up. Carter promised, but never delivered. In the end, Samora, Michel, and Cahora sat down independently of Mugabe and decided that the land issue could be delayed, that you couldn't win everything, and if you don't get independence now, there's going to be a white coup, military coup. So in fact, Samora intervenes at every point, and finally, when there's some doubt about Nkomo's loyalty, in a secret meeting with Mugabe, Cahora, and Nkomo, and all the leadership of the armed struggle, Samora addresses Nkomo and said, Nkomo, you never fought. You're always in bed with Ian Smith and the whites. If you don't want to be part of the revolution, then you're part of the problem. And and Como acquiesced. So in 1980, Zimbabwe becomes independent. You saw the pictures of Samora with Mugabe was elected president of the Patriotic Front, and Como is a figurehead vice president. 6 years later, and it was a moment of great joy, not only in Harare and all over throughout Mozambique, Zimbabwe, but throughout Mozambique. There was this sense of enormous solidarity, and throughout Tanzania and many other countries in Africa. 6 years later, Michel is killed. He's killed, my judgment, by the South Africans. They had to kill him. They could not afford to have a Black socialist leader on their border. They had to eliminate him. And across the continent, there was a sense of enormous loss and grief. Till this day, though, Samora remains a figure of great popularity in parts of Mozambique and in Zimbabwe, because after independence in Zimbabwe and after Samora dies in Mozambique, you have the structural adjustment. IMF imposes all these reforms, and corrupt privatization and corruption starts. And Samora is remembered to this day as harsh and strict, but as one who would not tolerate corruption. He's remembered in Mozambique and Zimbabwe and in South Africa as a model of what might have been. So that's 1975 to the present. So I'll be very happy to answer any questions. Again, let me re-emphasize, other people will have different interpretations of Samora. He was special to us, Bobby and myself. We admired him. He had many flaws, which I'll be happy to talk about, and many flawed policy, but he had a wonderful vision of what a socially just society could be. Okay, thank you.
Great questions.
Please.
Professor Brown?
Yeah, maybe just quickly.